This is almost a bit of a sort of a bad joke that I'm going to be taking another bite at this cherry and making another video that's something like the streamlined version of understanding. Well, in some sense, I guess I don't want to go through the four sides of the mind. I think I have done that in the other recordings, but there were issues that I was kind of tentatively trying to conjure up and talking about politics and things like that. And now I think I have a much better model after the last discussion that I just had. So I've kind of been refining this from all the discussions that I've had recently, explaining it to people, having the opportunity to refine and people asking clarifying questions, and then I kind of round out what I'm saying a bit better. So now I've got, I think, a good method of talking about what I'll just talk about in isolation, the unconscious side of the mind, taking in within the context of everything that I've put in the last two videos, which a lot of them are recapitulations. So I've got like a 4 hour video of me kind of loosely discovering this by kind of refining some of my self-actualization stuff, and then I keep on repeating the stuff about the Kegan stage 3 being the stickiest stage, being the unconscious work, the shadow work. And then I do go through these things, but now I've got a much better condensed version of essentially how to orientate yourself within Kegan stage 3, because I kind of laboriously went into it before. So a good way, I think, of understanding it is that Kegan stage 3, the shadow work of the unconscious side of the mind, that the what I keep on calling as the subconscious unconscious gateway filter, which is the narcissistic gateway filter, I will essentially now, and I laboriously go into the detail of that it's the repurposed inferior function and sin of the subconscious is being repurposed as the unconscious um, death and lust, or death and child function in MBTI speak, in some sense. And so you basically have the parent function of the subconscious as being the open conduit that is connecting to the dominant function in the unconscious. That those are the two sort of on either end of the fight over the two intermediary things, which are kind of are belong to both, depending on how much the dominant function is taking control of them and how much the subconscious parent function is letting go of them. Anyway, that's the actual sort of model on the substrate level. But just to talk about it from within the unconscious side of the mind, and this will be much more relatable to people, is that I would just call that general transition and that issue interpersonal issues. And in some sense, so another heading that I should rather put this under is that you have to know the unconscious side of the mind in three distinct ways. And then you have to start managing them in those three distinct parcels and those three distinct um, subcategories, because otherwise you'll never get a hold of the unconscious side of the mind. You'll never master Kegan stage 3. And I do think that this is tricky because you have to somewhat do it piecemeal, and you have to work towards refining it, and that is something of also cleaning up the what I call the 3.5 Kegan stage sort of now I'm calling it the transpersonal gateway filter, I guess, and I called it before the borderline gateway filter between the unconscious and the ego. And there is this deep connection between the interpersonal gateway filter and the transpersonal gateway filter, because essentially any dirt or residue or toxin that comes from the subconscious into the unconscious, and that is an unnecessary that is a what I wanted to say was that that is a necessary evil, that you can't ever have a perfectly clean connection between the subconscious and the unconscious, especially because you are birthed into the unconscious from the subconscious, where you have to kind of try to sublimate what was good in the subconscious, which I generally call via negativa, into a kind of understanding that this is your interpersonal karma that you have to kind of learn how to process. That's the food on your plate that you have to finish. And I do think that internally has to be sublimated properly into a properly grown up, dominant function in your unconscious side of the mind. So the unconscious side of the in the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind, that dominant function has to start to represent a synthesis, a proper synthesis that digests and sublimates the interpersonal induction that you had. So the death and the lust elements within the unconscious side of the mind is synthesized into the dominant function, which I would generally call related to the personal. And if you don't finish the food on your plate, if you leave some of that behind and you say, then that ends up being projected onto other people. You will project that interpersonally. And this is so there is a tug of war here, because essentially if you don't eat it, then it belongs to somebody else. Then you have to go find somebody else's plate to put it on. So in some sense, you end up having to, in some sense, the interpersonal aspect of the unconscious side of the mind and the interpersonal aspect of shadow work is something that you will always have to embody in a kind of de facto ongoing way, that you have to kind of represent to other people the interpersonal aspect of your unconscious side of the mind. But that you shouldn't try to regulate it in a very, you have to do it in a very fluid sort of way. So the interpersonal, in some sense, will always be fraught with potential toxicity, and navigating that will kind of always have to be a kind of immediate sort of sense of how you process that. And obviously it can be much easier if, depending on how much, let's say, how much your personal is willing to imbibe, how much of it, of the interpersonal, you can kind of process. And in some sense it's more complicated than that, because you what could be an interpersonal, a recurring interpersonal sort of issue that you don't have, you can't really swallow in your impersonal that well, in your, in the personal dominant function, is because in some sense um, it might be the fact that you've sort of recoded that, that in some sense something you had it, you've actually smuggled in a toxic belief from your subconscious, because all beliefs are toxic, because beliefs are never golden, they need context. And so in the interpersonal aspect of the unconscious side of the mind and shadow work, um, if you're trying to exalt a positive belief about something that you're trying to uphold in terms of your unconscious side of the mind, because your beliefs are correct or right, or you have a set of beliefs that are good enough or correct or right, or something like that, then what you will end up doing is, in some sense, your personal aspect of the unconscious side of the mind will be too good for something for you to process interpersonally, and you will just kind of, you know, you will redirect it back to the person who essentially, who you will say sent it to you. So the belief, in some sense, will end up creating an interpersonal um, conundrum or an interpersonal issue, and then in some sense that interpersonal issue will be transposed onto the transpersonal. And that, so there is this kind of direct relationship between the interpersonal and the transpersonal, that in some sense, um, if you acclimate yourself to some kind of interpersonal thing that you just sort of want to regulate, that you want to relegate to background noise, if you want to say that this interpersonal recurring drama is actually just background noise, uh, um, that is to be expected because I live in a fallen culture, in a fallen society, or something like that, it becomes a kind of transpersonal cloud. It becomes a narrative morality. I would even describe it as a kind of slave morality, that in some sense we need to live under a certain cloud. In some sense, the personal and the transpersonal need each other, and they are a kind of healthy dichotomy in which the one must reflect the other, and they must not need each other codependently, but the one must be a reflection of the other. Like the one must be sort of the dream, the atmosphere that the personal lives in some sense. But you should hopefully have an atmosphere that is capable of quite a lot of tolerance and quite a lot of, let's say, bootstrapping of the personal. But I just want to say as well that it's also important perhaps not to take extra responsibility onto the personal when you could redirect it back to somebody else. So this is the kind of the tug of war that in some sense, if somebody comes to you and says you've got an interpersonal problem and you need to fix yourself because you need to take personal responsibility for this, and you say no, I don't want to take personal responsibility for this because this is somebody else's responsibility, and I'm sort of stuck in the middle. And then maybe they'll say, well, can't you still take responsibility for it? And then you have to kind of work out if you have a justified stance here, or to sort of deflect it, or to redirect it, or to say no, that question itself is an imposition and it's improper, and it's and you essentially, sadly, we do get into interpersonal impasses with people because some people are just not prone to negotiation or persuasion or having any kind of sort of thorough way of conflict resolution. And in some sense, that can also be a conflict of transpersonal, sort of, let's say, moral modalities, that some person essentially would be, the things that I think are fundamentally toxic are people that don't believe that there is like an objective morality that is at least in principle capable, that we're in principle capable of agreeing with and being so, like, I don't believe that people should agree that I am correct in all of my statements or whatever, but as a category that it's at least that we can attain to a single faith, or that um, that at least in as a hypothetical concept, that we should be able to agree on a morality that we can by agreement say is an objective morality. Without having the confidence, in some sense, that's almost representing a kind of stage 4 ability, that you can kind of um, in a co-creative way, that you can agree on a shared reality. In some sense, there's somewhat building self-determinism and building, essentially, I think, classical liberal political philosophy and the integrity of the free will and such like that. That's how I see my sort of transpersonal sort of cloud, which is something of like the recipe and the vision of the culture that would be my ideal culture. But I don't try to expand that idealism into a utopianism or something like that. And in some sense, it's very much just cloud enough for me to be able to say that personally I could live in a society that was populated by people that had the same mentality as myself. But it's more dynamic than that, because also you can't just say, well, I would be happy to live with myself, but also that I would also be able to tolerate other people developing and growing. And in some sense, this was an interesting point of discussion, that and I think that this is where a lot of the political confusion comes in, is this fake idea, or this very bad transpersonal idea, that somehow we could all become Kegan stage 4 at the same time, and that we're not always going to be a mixed society of mixed Kegan stages, and that you need to have, essentially, you can't expect politics, and you can't expect sort of the legislative arm of politics and the political side of politics to be anywhere higher than Kegan stage 3. You can expect the courts to be Kegan stage 4, I would say, but you cannot expect politics and the culture in a society, and let's say the kind of the morality of a society, to reach higher than Kegan stage 3. Otherwise you would have to live in a cult, in a kind of authoritarian theocracy or something like that. You can't do that in a secular society, also because you can't legislate morality and values. It has to be a pedagogy, and you have to be able to tolerate, in some sense, a mixed society. Anyway, but sorry, I'm just, from a psychological level, I'm just trying to say that these three distinct categories of interpersonal, personal, and transpersonal is is the is really a good model of trying to sort out your shadow work, because essentially excuse me. what you want to do is your and the hardest part is that when you start off in the unconscious side of the mind, everything, the whole unconscious side of the mind is interpersonal, and you have to kind of whittle away at that interpersonal sort of ambiguity at the start and carve out a personal space, carve out a personal etching of yourself, of some boundaries between you and the interpersonal, because you are just like a drop in the ocean at the start. And then at some point you have to kind of work out the boundary between you, your personal boundary of your contribution um, to the unconscious mass, which has been there before you, and you are relating to it with the same kind of constituent parts as everyone else is relating to the complexity of that sort of amalgamated interpersonal drama and mess in some sense. And so your dominant function has this role to play in your unconscious side of the mind of your particular prime contribution, or sort of sort of the sledgehammer of how you engage in some sense. It's the control center of your unconscious command post, and then in some sense we can get very thematically confused, because in some sense we can already see the theme of that and how it exists in the current sort of panentheism, in the current sort of Greek mythos of the current setup of the day. Is that, what is Zeus doing now to Hera? What is Hera, how is Hera undermining Zeus's divine order of, of the, just to kind of project it into a kind of mythos in some sense. And there are these latent themes, and sexuality is a huge thing within the unconscious mind, because the whole cycle of life and every kind of can be somewhat projected into some kind of um, relation between the sexes, or something like that. And so there's so many different ways in which the intellectual mass of the unconscious sort of takes these metaphorical visages, and that we can kind of see ourselves in a sea of personality, of which our circuitry is essentially a mirror and a fragment of this, sort of kaleidoscopic amalgamate, which we're somewhat, it's like walking up to the Tower of Babel after other people are already in the process of building it, and then you think, oh, could I join this, or something like that, um, and then how do I help contribute in building the Tower of Babel? And in some sense, this is the folly of the personal without the transpersonal. That essentially the personal does need to work out some structure of itself. It does need to know its distinction from the interpersonal. And as it's building the Tower of Babel, helping to build the Tower of Babel, it has to work out that this is not going to reach the heavens, and that you actually need to have a transpersonal connection with the Kegan stage 4 in some sense. You need a transpersonal thing, which is the bridge from Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4, which tells you that actually there's no way to mitigate and process between the interpersonal and the personal. That fundamental tension is fundamentally toxic, because in some sense you are also generating interpersonal waves of disorder and disharmony. So you are going up to other people and you're causing havoc, and other people are causing havoc with you, and you're trying to negotiate. And there is some learning that you can get from that kind of negotiation, in terms of putting that insight into developing a more robust transpersonal morality in some sense. I do think that in some sense the Mark Passio talks about natural law, for instance, and I do think that that is a pretty good, that kind of metaphysical deep dive in some sense, that kind of substance is exactly what you need to go into in order to make the transition between Kegan stage 3 and Kegan stage 4, and get into Kegan stage 4 in a properly sort of robust way. Although I haven't seen everything that Mark Passio talks about, so I don't want to blanketly endorse all of his opinions and political sort of views and things like that. But I do think, in terms of the moral schema, that I think he's pretty much, he emphasizes the right things. In principle, I think he is correct, and that's anyway. Anyway, and I think he is modeling a bridge from Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4 in the mode of this transpersonal connection and synthesis, which is generally a pretty good, robust um, bridge, I would say. And that what it does do, though, is that even if you have the perfect transpersonal bridge, you still need to work out and disentangle the problems between the personal and the interpersonal, because in some sense you can still have a toxic interpersonal thing, because you've lost your own subconscious beliefs and memories when you started developing the unconscious side of the mind, because you just you converted your beliefs into a style of being, into a habitual flow, into a kind of drama that you thematically associate with all the other things that are going on in your society. And so, because you only can develop the personal on the other side of an interpersonal kind of milieu, which you get overpowered by as you step into the unconscious side of the mind, you your whole memory kind of gets reset in some sense. And so you recode your memories because you just accept your own belief structure, because you came from the subconscious, you came from a set of beliefs, and you didn't fix your beliefs before you plugged them in to the unconscious. So you're coming with a lot of hidden baggage. You have a lot of thematic, tacit, implicit sort of projections that you might be projecting onto other people's interpersonal. You're saying, oh, you've got an interpersonal problem, when it's actually you that has the interpersonal problem, and you've just actually almost projected it onto a transpersonal sort of narrative, moral narrative, slave morality as well, perhaps. And so there is this thing in which all your dirty interpersonal karma that you are not personally taking responsibility for, because you've found a way to kind of disguise it into conflict and aggression with other people, that essentially because other people are dirty in their interpersonal controversies and their interpersonal how they deal with people, but essentially, because we can't draw very clear lines and work out how to communicate and navigate how to essentially our personal, the Kegan stage 3 personal development is on such a low level that you're actually stuck between your own naive narcissism and a transpersonal kind of overreach, that your cloud is kind of overreaching in the narrative scope, and you've got a block on each of your shoulders, and that's how you stay balanced. Is that sorry, is that the phrase? What did they say? You've got a chip on your. You've got a chip on both of your shoulders, and so you think that you don't have a chip on either of your shoulders, because you've got a chip on your naive narcissism, and you've got a chip on your transpersonal morality in some sense. Um, and if you're, I think that, so Mark Passio talks about natural law. I'll talk about objective morality, which is which is something that is made sort of in present time, or at least is capable of being made in present time, because you believe that you can actually create a shared reality by agreement, that you can actually communicate effectively enough, and that there is enough awareness in the present that the ego can actually restructure and reconvene and remodel a a confidence in its own ability to create and also destroy and also forgive and also do anything in some sense. And Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot in terms of the kind of the reclamation of the idea that you are also a dangerous person, that you are also capable of being uh, a god in Auschwitz, a that you would also be a Nazi soldier. That if you can't empathize with that, if you can't understand how you could have just been brainwashed, or you could have just gone along with the crowd, you could have just been part of a mob mentality, just you would have just plugged yourself into the slave morality. If you can't even imagine that, then you really don't even understand the nature of the unconscious side of the mind. Just how easily you could have just been sort of inducted into having a chip on both shoulders and being trapped within the unconscious side of the mind, and not even realize that you had the shadow work to do because it was so convenient and your culture was so poised on just kind of scapegoating somebody else's interpersonal naive narcissism, because we all have sections of the population in every society, in every there will always be people that are on a different Kegan stage, and you can't expect everyone to be on Kegan stage 4. It's not possible, and in some sense, you can't craft a culture even around Kegan stage 4. You can have sections of a culture that represent Kegan stage 4 to the population. You can have a constitution that has a legal system embedded in it that attains to Kegan stage 4. You can have a in some sense that's like the hieroglyphics of okay, that's a bit of a metaphor, but my example here is that you know Egyptian children in ancient Egypt, maybe their parents were Kegan stage 3, but that little child could have grown up to be a priest in that religion or whatever, in that society, in that culture. And so their Kegan stage 3 parents would tell the children about the religious stories. They would tell them about the story of Osiris and the story of Horus and all these sorts of, and the god of the sun and the god of this and the god of that. And that would unlock the alchemy in their mind, that they would see essentially how this is like the Greek pantheon, that it tells you a knowledge about how the spirit and how the soul work. It's a way of knowing yourself. It's a way of sort of seeing how, in some sense, it's a way of saying, it's like a metaphorical way of explaining the state of culture in terms of the unconscious through the exoteric religious myth, which in some sense allows the young to plug themselves in at a very high level to anticipate the let's say the karmic burden and what the karmic settlement is within the kind of the transpersonal. So if they want to actually, if they have it within themselves to kind of modulate the transpersonal compact of the society, they have to know at least, because you can be above the level of the culture and the society. And in some sense, I do think that you can't expect a culture to be higher than Kegan stage 3. It has to kind of be on Kegan. You can expect a kind of a robust personal thing, because otherwise you don't give people the space to have an interpersonal, private assessment of their own distinction between the personal and the interpersonal. And you also force down people's throats a transpersonal dogma and orthodoxy. And then you go the way of the gulag, and you go the way of the Nazis, and you go the way of propaganda, and you go the way of what the left journalism does in America and the Democrats in America. Tulsi Gabbard aside, Tulsi Gabbard is, I think, probably the only one that I know that is very, or and Yang, I guess, Jason Yang, uh, that or at least opposed to identity politics. Although I am slightly wary that Jason Yang sort of uses these, basic income as a kind of, as like a magic sort of wizardry that's going to kind of, that I think in some sense might be the same kind of sort of wishful utopian, sort of imposition that, oh, we can as a culture be Kegan stage 4. I think in some sense Yang doesn't straddle that line. I mean, he perhaps has the energy of compromise and of doing the best thing, but when he already commits himself to a policy that I think does need to be looked at, in some sense, I do think that that would be part of the same idea that, anyway, I won't talk about it now, essentially, but the idea that you can just bestow on people high status and integrity, and in some sense that you can say, no, 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 you are Kegan stage 4, as a kind of, as a gift of the state, as a sort of entitlement and beneficiary. And I'm not saying that some people wouldn't be able to make wonderful use of the grant, and in some sense, I think the only safe way to do it is if you did it uh, inconsistently. If you didn't do it as a permanent thing, but you did it like in 1 year in every 20 years, or 1 year in every 15 years, like you did it 1 year in every 10 years, as a kind of intergenerational sort of I mean, I guess you would have to maybe find a fairer way to do it, that essentially that you would give it to people at certain years in their life, that you would give it to them when they reach their age of majority, and then you would give them another year at 25, and you would give them another year at 30, that you would kind of space it out, that they would get a basic income grant at a kind of at a non-consistent interval, just to kind of give them a bit of a leg up, just to give them a bit of a kind of an oomph or something like that. And then in some sense, if they fail to make good use of it, if they fail to kind of use it to kind of help themselves, then it's essentially they could have the time to recoup, or to think about it the next time it happened again, or something like that. But in some sense, I think that it's fraught with a because I do think that if you just do something across the board, I do think that you're expecting people to take responsibility for their own lives, and in some sense, like that tactic has, I think, already conceptually failed. Like, it doesn't fail in every case, but in some sense, when it becomes a kind of consistent entitlement, um, you actually end up just kind of creating a perverse incentive for people to kind of reach a lower level of dependency. Um, and in some sense, I think you can only kind of do it if you have the kind of high trust society in which it doesn't just come with no strings attached. And this is the big problem of it. I think that you would end up having to police it on these sorts of lines. You would end up having to say, well, you don't get a basic income grant if you have a child out of wedlock, which you would never be able to get away with that, because that's a kind of, you don't want your government to dictate morality to its citizens. But in some sense, morality is the thing that keeps responsibility alive in the citizenry. So if you can't have it come with morality strings attached, then you are going to end up creating a perverse incentive that's going to end up adopting, the state is going to become the sole parent of the citizen. That family units and independence are basically, are going to be completely sort of perversely undermined and de-incentivized, and essentially you're going to, anyway. I mean, this is the problem with transpersonal overreach, essentially. And it's because you're not willing to kind of realize that there is actually, in this Kegan stage 3, we do need to actually find a real stable solution to this. Because Kegan stage 3 is the most, I'm not going to repeat all that stuff that's in my other recordings, but it becomes the source of where your principles come from. And you're not going to be a principled person unless you legitimately and authentically actually fix all the issues in Kegan stage 3. Now, it is complicated because in some sense they can only be properly fixed in Kegan stage 5, but in principle you have to kind of know a bit about how these things are worked, how they are stabilized, something that eventually you need to realize that I do think you end up having to turn your back on the interpersonal, and you need to orientate yourself just between the personal and the transpersonal. That in some sense your personal is so well sublimated in terms of its exposure to the interpersonal toxicity that it knows about its own toxicity, it knows about its propensity of its own toxicity, and it knows about the toxicity of other people's interpersonal kind of, the example that I give of this is that, it's kind of like at a buffet and there's a food fight and there are also kinds of shenanigans and people are sneaking other things onto other people's plates, and, trying to fight over, the shrimp or something like that. And so the problem is that the unconscious side of the mind is fundamentally grounded in this sort of buffet kind of source of everything. So, it starts off ambiguous. It starts off where everything is mixed up together. It's all a banquet table that everyone is equally, in theory, able to take from. But then people have different things on their plates, and then you also have that some people are sneaking things onto other people's plates, and some people might be trying to take things from other people's plates as well. And so, you know, that's the kind of personal interpersonal metaphor that I would have there. And then in some sense, you have to bootstrap the personal, I would say, and turn your back on the interpersonal, in that you have actually sublimated as much as you can. In some sense, you can see that if the interpersonal seems to be charging up again, then you take another look at it and you manage it in an embodied way. So in some sense, the interpersonal is a constant dance that you are embodying as you are dodging the slings and arrows from the interpersonal. But then in some sense, you're also keeping an eye on yourself, because if you keep on having to dodge the same slings and arrows, then you probably need to, there's something in the personal that isn't reconciled with your own interpersonal contribution. So, but in some sense, that's also, maybe that's completely predictable from your transpersonal sort of thing. So, but then you also should be worried about refining your transpersonal. So in some sense, I do think we end up getting into a kind of horse trading around the transpersonal, and I do think that that's a proper horse trading towards this objective morality, or between trying to real steel man a single faith, that it all fits together and works out. And then in some sense, you're basically saying, okay, well, either my transpersonal is dirty, there's something wrong with it, or there's something fishy with it, and I need to work out how to fix it. So in some sense, at some point you get, maybe this is Dharma dueling or something like that, that either I cut it or you eat it. So, if you get into the trust space in which you say, well, either this thing that's in my transpersonal belief structure is not in yours because yours is lacking it, or mine is an overreach. And you kind of have that intimacy and trust that we are actually trying to attain towards a single-mindedness. We're trying to attain towards a single quality of understanding, a single principled, sort of, that the essence of our principal systems are commensurate, that they are compatible in some sense. But then obviously we might all have a different, so we share the same transpersonal in theory, or we should try to aim to, at least in concept, be able to share the transpersonal. Because if it's not capable of being shared, then in some sense it's not fit for purpose, because then it's not a dream that can be shared, because it's something like the atmosphere in which the personal wants to orientate itself underneath, within the atmospheric, um, anyway, I feel like I'm slightly failing in robustly talking about the content of the personal. Um, but in some sense, the interpersonal needs to be cleaned up only after all the stuff that I describe in the other recording. After you're in Kegan stage 5, then the interpersonal gets the proper partition against the subconscious. So then you don't have that toxic influence anymore of the parent function from the subconscious with its puppet strings on your interpersonal narcissistic gateway filter, or the interpersonal aspect in, so the interpersonal aspect in the unconscious side of the mind is going to have a problem in it. And it's also potentially going to have complications as well, but I don't want to repeat those there. But basically, those complications only come into effect once you start crucifying your ego. And when you start crucifying your ego, you might awaken one of the circuits in your unconscious side of the mind that was dormant, essentially. But anyway, I deal with that in the last recording that I made on the subject, and that's somewhat complicated, but. And transpersonal is a good way of describing it as well, because in some sense the things that literally correspond to the transpersonal, although they find their synthesis in the dominant function in the ego, those two ingredients are actually in the metagram circuitry, which is essentially the unconscious side of the mind is metagram circuitry. But it's also complicated because the metagram circuitry is emotional tones and styles and sequences of drama and cycles of action in some sense that have a cross wiring of all different components from all the different sides of the mind, from the subconscious, from the superego, from the unconscious. Although I haven't checked up on every single type, so I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe not the superego. I'd have to clerically look through that, and I don't have a way to model all my different personality styles yet. But anyway, the point is that cross wiring and essentially there are 6 component parts in the unconscious side of the mind in metagram circuitry. So there's six consecutive emotional tones, and the first 4 are particularly unique, and the last 2 are a repetition of those first 4, or some of 2 of those first 4. The last 2 are a repetition, and so the transpersonal is already capable of resequencing, of fitting into the first 4 because they are embedded within the first 4. So the transpersonal is capable of being a very fluid bridge between the ego and the unconscious, because it already has the power of resequencing the unconscious. And this is how the ego is capable of essentially recoding your own memories, because when you're in the unconscious side of the mind, you can sublimate your subconscious narcissism about some belief that you have, about a memory that you've had. You can encode that into a habitual unconscious pattern and style of being that is woven into the tapestry of the drama and things like that. And so you can occlude your own memory from yourself. You can occlude your own functioning, because of this transpersonal. I mean, transpersonal is such a good way actually of describing it, because of this overlap. Anyway, you'll just have to sort of take my word for it, because I don't have the visuals to kind of even talk about it, but also it requires a whole induction into my whole models and things. But in some sense, this is all just to get into Kegan stage 4, because once you're in Kegan stage 4 in a stable way, and most people do get a taste of Kegan stage 4, and I think that there is such a thing as Kegan stage 4.5, but what Kegan stage 4.5 is, in fact, is that you have actually gone through a whole cycle of your unconscious side of the mind. You've entered your ego, but you don't like your inferior function in your ego, so you end up progressing back to your dominant function in your ego, and your ego actually colludes with the unconscious side of the mind. And then you get the chip on both shoulders, because you end up trying to create a way to trick yourself into thinking that the unconscious mind is broader than it is deeper than it is an infinite space of a playground, and you end up sort of creating two chips on your shoulders, which are like two mirrors. That essentially the interpersonal becomes a mirror, and the transpersonal becomes a mirror, and they're parallel to one another. And between those two mirrors, they're reflecting each other, and you think you've created an infinite scope of metafluidity, but you're actually just in Kegan stage 3. And I do think that you can also call that Kegan stage 4.5, because between those two things, there's a resonance between that and the dominant function in the ego. And so you do have a real presence in the ego, but not in the deeper recesses of the ego, only in the dominant function of the ego and maybe the collusive parent function. But you certainly will not have an appreciation of your own inferior function. In some sense, you'll be afraid of your own inferior function, and instead of dealing with that, you've got this space to explore between the two mirrors, to kind of deflect and to kind of, and in some sense that's kind of slave morality. That's Nietzschean slave morality in a in a psychological model. Although I'd have to get perhaps more precise about what's happening between the parent function that is being potentially collusive or something like that. But in some sense, the parent function is scared shitless about the inferior function because it knows that it can't handle it. It doesn't like what the inferior function does to it. So the parent function wants just to sit idle, and the parent function is so afraid of, it just doesn't want to do anything. It's just kind of, it's robotically trying to pray that the dominant function is going to redirect all attention back into the unconscious. That it's essentially, it's covering over its own dishonesty in some sense. So there's this kind of, and in some sense, the parent function has the power to do that. The parent function is the power behind the throne of the dominant function. That it can kind of create a false call to arms. In some sense, it's like a courtier that can kind of twist the ear of the king, which is in some sense the dominant function. Or at least, well, king is perhaps too high a word. There's a bit of a stupid metaphor. But essentially, the dominant function is in charge of allowing attention to flow into the ego. And so somehow the parent function has convinced the dominant function to in some sense, the dominant function also doesn't like the inferior function. This really, okay. Let me reframe all of this, because what I've just said is a bit confused, even. But because sadly I can only frame this in the teleological sense of actually how to get through Kegan stage 4 into Kegan stage 5. So the real solution is that you have to perfect the vanity, which is the idea that the dominant function must take damage from the inferior function. That you actually have to believe that if your dominant function gets cut by your inferior function, that it will heal stronger back. And you actually have to the parent function has to let the inferior function cut the dominant function down to size, because if the dominant function does not get cut down to size, it won't be able to bring the parent function into a cut. This is a weird kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because in some sense, the reason why the dominant function is redirecting attention back to the unconscious side of the mind into Kegan stage 3 is because the parent function is too fat, is too gross, is too perverse. And the reason why the parent function is perverse is because, in some sense, the dominant function is afraid of the inferior function, and the parent function likes being fat. And it likes being it likes being the power behind the throne. It doesn't like, so in some sense, so it's like the courtier that doesn't allow the common person to go and see and talk to the king, so that the king realizes the effect of his rule on the common person, because the parent function is kind of like stealing the money, is doing all these other deals. It's got this institutionalized corruption behind the throne or something like that. And so it's like a catch-22, is that if the inferior function would kind of bring the dominant function into a kind of realism, then the vision of the parent function would be able to allow for its own sacrifice. Because in some sense, the parent function does need to be sacrificed for the goodness of the inferior function. Because the inferior function, in some sense, is the final redeeming note in the whole sad story of the false ego complex. It all comes up to the inferior function. It all comes up to the torture that the inferior function represents. And that torture is inflicted on the parent function, because the parent function is the fleshly thinking that must be sacrificed. It must not be desensitized. It must be consciously eviscerated by what the inferior function goes through itself, because the inferior function must be silent in its torture. You must be silent before your accusers, that you witness the disagreement that your inferior function has with what is going on, and with in the horror of the sacrifice of the parent function, that the fleshly thinking has to take the slings and arrows in the silence of the inferior function. So the inferior function is a silent witness to the massacre of the parent function. And in this way, and then whenever you do speak, when you speak on behalf of the sin, because this is all sin, because you're in disagreement with what's going on, but you were silent before your accusers. You were silent. And then the sin that's going on, when you do speak, you don't speak to your accusers, you speak to your own God. You speak to you, and you take responsibility you own the sin of the world. You say, God, why have you forsaken me? Father, why have you forsaken me? Even though you have a disagreement in you about what's going on, you have a disagreement with your accusers, but you don't throw them under the bus. You say, you own the sin of the world, and you die to the sin of the world, and you actually do die. Your ego, the sin of your ego dies, and your inferior function, in some sense, waits with it in the grave to be resurrected. And the inferior function, which was the sin, doesn't endure the crucifixion. It's the inferior function, the trial, that endures the crucifixion, and it must wait 3 days. The sin itself is also the death of the superego, and the child function of the superego is the second day, and then the third day is the dominant function of the superego, and that is the day that you resurrect. And then your inferior function and the superego's dominant function, those things become consonant with each other. There's a consonance. There's an attunement of that the experience of the torture of the inferior function is impregnated into the dominant function in the superego, because the superego never had a dominant function before. It was a floating parent function. It was a floating false prophet. And that was why the subconscious, I'm not going to repeat this stuff, but essentially I go into this in the other recording. But that is the fundamental toxicity of the subconscious, which then is obviously inherited into this puppet-stringed interpersonal toxicity in the unconscious, which is even the toxicity in the ego, which is why the ego doesn't want to crucify itself. At base, it doesn't want to crucify itself. And in some sense, that's usually expressed by being trapped in Kegan stage 3. So a lot of people have worked out, let's say, a jerry-rigged way to think that they're Kegan stage 5, because they have a fatty transpersonal they have some presence in Kegan stage 4, but they have, let's say, they've mistaken Kegan stage 5 for a transpersonal Kegan stage 3 sort of 3-4 conduit. So the bridge between Kegan stage 3 and Kegan stage 4, they've fudged that essentially, and then they've just squared it off by having a chip on both shoulders, because essentially they're projecting interpersonal narcissism onto other people. And it is true that some people are prone to interpersonal narcissism. So it's half true. Yes, some people are, but that's life in some sense. You can't expect people to not be on the Kegan stage that they're on, and it doesn't help when you're projecting onto them with your sort of your transpersonal cult of anyway of that's overcharged and essentially anyway. So I've made the point, and essentially, I do think that part of growing up in your personal unconsciousness and reconciling that with your with the transpersonal is, in some sense, political liberal philosophy, or British political liberalism in some sense, classical libertarian thinking. Um, and I kind of, I talk about this at the end of the last recording, the end of the 3.5 hour recording, where I make these weird notes about politics and stuff like that. But I think now, at least, maybe this recording has rounded it off a bit better way. Um, yeah, let me not waffle on. I guess I'll just end it there.